Hey everyone, Natalie here, and in this video we're going to be looking at institutional benefits, difficulties, and perceived barriers in IRBs. So let's get started. As I said, the first step we're going to be looking at some benefits, the second aspect are risks and drawbacks, and lastly we'll be covering some cost considerations. So when we think about benefits, CTTI defines several arguments in favor of use of an external IRB. According to their website, use of a single central IRB may save time and money and make sure the research is being done in the same way each time. This time saved in using a single IRB may advance the speed of doing research. There is likely a point of diminishing returns having multiple IRBs review the same protocol, especially when the local IRB is prohibited from suggesting any changes to the protocol, take it or leave it, and the consent form. Instead, there is little in the literature to support the benefit of multiple reviews, particularly when the reviews were constrained from making changes. Without an institutional IRB, the institution might be able to decrease the administrative support, the office space, and the money spent using IRB administrators to conferences and any compliance issues. In doing this calculation, however, the institution may find that other tasks such as coordination with IRBs, tracking the research approval externally, working on interinstitutional agreements, may simply shift the resources from the IRB to the research program. A considerable resource, faculty time, may be saved in a university, for example, when faculty are excused from their IRB role and are able to return to their academic clinical functions. Members of central IRBs may be more impartial as well. They are not part of the local institutional structure and are not subject to the various interests that could influence the judgment of members or local boards. All right, now let's look at the risks and drawbacks. Now, on the other hand, there have been many concerns raised about the use of external IRB review. IRB liability and perceived liability are institutional concerns, though they are no longer as much of a problem as they were when the shift to external IRB review started. So let's first look at the regulatory liability. If the common rule 45 CFR 46 subpart A covers institutional obligations, and if the institution is responsible for the IRB, then it would stand to reason that the institution would be responsible under their assurance for any regulatory problems of the external IRB, even with an arrangement. Now that is being reversed. In all the guidance since 2000, OHRP has attempted to reassure institutions and to be clear about separation of responsibility. They all archived old documents that discouraged the use of external IRBs and posted a 2010 letter to and from Carolinas Medical Center in which Dr. Menikoff stated, quote, "I want to assure you that the Office for Human Research Protections fully agrees with the FDA's want to assure you that the Office for Human Research Protections fully agrees with FDA's position on the benefits of relying on a single central IRB for multi-center research," close quote. Now, he continues on stating that essentially the IRB office, or IRBs are being archived due to the position that OHRP no longer believes that they're necessarily needed. Now, under FDA regulations, the investigator rather than the institution is responsible for having review by an IRB that complies with 2.1 CFR 5.6 institutional review boards. Now let's look at some legal liability here. So there's very little legal precedent about institutional responsibility for actions of an external IRB, so institutional counsel are often quick to underline all the possible issues and point out to all the difficulties associated with reliance. Now, public liability and public relations. Negative publicity that is attached to the institutional sanctions is viewed as an institutional failure. Now, that's pretty big. Peers and public alike would lose respect for the institution. If the actual failure were from the IRB, the institution would likely still bear the public stigma. Now, in kind of considering on that same strand institutional losses, let's look at that in a bit more detail. A lot can be lost when an IRB ceases to exist in an institution or ceases to review large swaths of studies. So loss of knowledge is a huge aspect when we think about institutional losses. When the IRB is a part of the institution, members chat with peers who are doing research and maybe who have problems, and they share information both directions. They can speak with colleagues about issues or concerns and can bring it back to those issues to the IRB. So it's really a two-way communication channel that is likely difficult to replace with the use of an external IRB. Another aspect is loss of involvement. So in higher education, for example, when faculty members are themselves IRB members, the worth of the IRB becomes more personal. Without faculty involvement, submissions to the IRB loses its immediacy and can become just a bureaucratic stumbling block to research. Another concern is loss of control. So an institution that once was able to control the IRB through appointment of members and the writing of IRB policies is likely to miss exercising that control when using an external IRB. Quality of research is also an issue, and this really is raised in reference to institutional liability with an external IRB fails to reach the minimum standard. And lastly, conflation of IRB and institutional responsibilities. Okay, so one of the biggest obstacles has been the conflation of IRB and institutional responsibilities. Many mandated responsibilities, both funded and not funded, have been given to or simply assumed by the IRB. Separating the IRB from these functions takes recognition first and then time, as the responsibilities are reassigned from the IRB to other members at the institution, and an example is seen in the conflict of interest review. All right, that's about it for that section. Let's move on to some cost considerations. So using an external IRB may reduce the financial costs attributed to the IRB function. However, there are also some new or increased institutional costs because IRB functions will have to be carried out by others. So let's think about the following questions. Number one, who tracks the research portfolio? Tracking the research portfolio is often an IRB duty, and the IRB often presents an annual report of work performed. The institution needs to determine how the data is gathered, if at all, and who's responsible for it. The second step is who coordinates approvals. Coordination of approval with other parts of the institution often falls to the IRB. So for example, the IRB often asks other departments about resources available. The IRB often notifies other units such as pharmacy, nursing, accounting, legal affairs, news services, and the like about approval of research study. In the absence of an internal IRB, these responsibilities must be reassigned to others at the institution. The next question is, who reviews and manages conflict of interests? So responsibility for determining conflict of interest occasionally rests with the IRB. The institution must determine who is responsible to review the investigator's conflicts and how reviewing the IRB is notified of them. The institution must also determine how conflict mitigation will be accomplished. Another question is, what about HIPAA guidance? Now, if an IRB is responsible for HIPAA duties, the institution must determine if there is a privacy officer who is aware of the shift and able to advise about HIPAA research. Another question is, who will pay for the review? How will it be invoiced? Who will be responsible for assuring all charges are invoiced and paid? A couple more questions. Who is the liaison for the external IRB or IRBs? Who receives reports from the external IRB and makes sure that there's an internal procedure to handle them? These are all really valid questions that need to be considered by an institution that's choosing to use an external IRB. Another question is, who will review the agreements and perform any assessments on their success? And lastly, who will make policy decisions? You know, experienced IRB members and administrators often write an internal research policy and enforce it. Without involvement of these authorities, there should be consideration of how much policy will be made and enforced. That being said, for more information on IRBs, continue on to the next section in Module 2.